everyone, Christina here for Card Player TV for another edition of Strategy. And I've got Andrew Brokos here to talk to me. Thanks so much for coming.
Hi, Christy.
He is a Card Player Pro and Poker Savvy coach, and he dominates the cash games that he plays. So let's talk about throwing some wrinkles into your game and what you can do to kind of open up your play and experiment a little.
Yeah, I think a big problem that a lot of people settle into, especially people who play a whole lot of tables, I mean, it's good for your hourly rate to play a lot of tables, but you do tend to fall into playing mechanically, which especially when you're playing against a lot of the same people, if they're paying attention to that, it's something they're going to be able to take advantage of. And if they're all kind of playing the same way that you are, you don't really have any kind of edge on them. I mean, if you're all just open raising the same hands from the same positions and three betting the same hands, all you're really doing is passing money around and maybe waiting for someone to tilt and make a few mistakes. And if you look over kind of the history of online poker anyway, the people who have made a lot of money in games are people who started doing something that no one else was doing. Like a really good example of this, back in the party poker days, there's this guy Blood, Sweat, Tears and a few other people who started to figure out that people gave way too much respect to 3-bets, because back then people only 3-bet like queens plus and ace king. And so he realized, if I just start 3-betting people brutally in position and just 3-bet them with everything, no one's going to know what to do about it. And those people killed those games for a few months, and it took probably over a year for most of the poker world to catch up to that, and now is incredibly common even in small stakes 6-max games to see a whole lot of 3-betting going on. So what I would recommend for a lot of people, especially if you feel like your game is in a little bit of a rut, is to start doing something different that you don't ordinarily do. And so this might be stuff, it might even be things that you think of as being like only bad players would do this. So it might be min betting or min check raising, it might be limping into the pot, cold 4-betting in a spot where you wouldn't ordinarily do it, over betting the pot, under betting the pot, just kind of weird stuff that not only is it not part of your mechanical strategy, but it's not part of your opponent's mechanical strategy either. So your opponents are probably very accustomed to dealing with someone who raises their big blind from the button. They know how to deal with that situation. They've been in it a million times. They know how to deal with people 3-betting them. They don't necessarily know how to deal with someone over-betting the turn when it pairs. Or it's a spot they've never been in before. And a lot of times people are going to make some kind of mistake. So I don't even know that you necessarily, certainly it's better if you have a plan, but I think sometimes you can just kind of put yourself in an interesting spot and just say, I'm just going to overbet the pot here and see what this guy does, see how he responds to it. And then you throw it in your game a few more times, see how it's working for you, and think through it. Think through it after the session, and how did that work out? Was I using it in the right spot? What made it a good spot? Why did it work? Why didn't it work? How did this guy respond? How can I adapt to his adaptation? All that sort of stuff. That's what gets you thinking about the game, rather than just going through the motions and doing what you saw someone do in a video, but actually thinking through how you're going to make it happen.
There was a term that Phil Galfond used, which is player intensity, which is if you're playing less tables, you're going to have a higher intensity because you're paying more attention to the table. I like that. So when you're doing this kind of thing, it kind of forces you to keep your player intensity high, and you probably have to adjust and, like you said, play fewer tables, but at least you're thinking about the game, because I definitely see that people who multi-table, they have a system, right, that they just use, and they never put themselves in those situations. Have you seen yourself come across a few things that have worked for you that you may not have been doing in your game before, trying some of these things?
The biggest thing that I think I've implemented successfully, and this I really only do this when I play full ring games, but it's limping into the pot. And I think a lot of people, it's not something I do in 6-max games pretty much ever, at least not as the first person into the pot. And because so many people who play, at least who play seriously online, have a 6-max background, they tend to have an aversion to limping, and they just don't ever open limp. But really at a full ring table, especially when you're deep stacked, I think there's a lot of advantages to limping in the early positions, and you get to see, what is everyone behind me going to do? It's a big difference having 8 people behind you versus having 5 people behind you. And so you get to find out, before you put a lot of money into the pot with like a small pair or a suited connector, how much strength is there and where is that strength. Right, if you raise an early position and get 3-bet by a guy who has aces, you probably don't have the right odds to call and look for your set. If you limp in, the guy with aces raises and you call, now you do have the right odds to look for your set. It's tricky to do it with a balanced range, but if you also limp under the gun with like pocket aces and you re-raise the guy, but then you limp other stuff and sometimes you re-raise them and they always assume you have aces anyway and fold. I mean, you have to figure out how to do it in a balanced way, but that's part of what I mean when I say it forces you to think creatively about the game and forces you to think through things and say, well, everyone assumes limp re-raising is a donk play. How can I make it not a donk play? Well, what can I do? Why is it a donk play, and what can I do to make it work?
One thing I wanted to ask is that, yeah, that definitely makes sense, like limping with small pairs and suited connectors in early position, but you don't want to be predictable because every time you play back at them, if it's low cards, they're like, oh, he probably limped in with a small pair, But do you want to be doing that with hands like ace-10, ace-jack, or like king-queen, queen-jack that could maybe get you in trouble with top pair and stuff like that?
The way I think about these situations is you start where you started. So what are the hands that I would ideally want to be limping in with? And you're right, it's like the sort of implied odds hands, where you're not necessarily looking to win unimproved all that often. You're looking to see the flop relatively cheaply against someone else has a big hand and win a big pot when you make a big hand. So then you say, what is my opponent going to do to stop me from doing that? What most people do is they just relentlessly raise limpers. So when you limp in, they raise and they bet with anything. And then you're folding too often, and even when you hit your hand, they don't have a hand anyway to pay you off. And your hand is kind of face up, so like if an ace flops, they might double barrel at you because they figure you have a small pair and the ace didn't help you. So then you need to think, okay, that's what they're doing to exploit me. What do I need to do to protect myself from that? So then it's sort of like what you were suggesting again. Maybe every once in a while you limp in with like ace-queen suited. And then I'm going to, you refer to it as a trouble hand because you maybe make the ace and it's not good. But in that situation where you think about what does my range look like to the other guy, he thinks I have a medium pair. So you probably can just check call down with ace-queen on the ace-high board, and if your opponent is going to that's balanced by the fact that sometimes you check calling once and then check folding when you have a medium pair. When you have the ace queen, you're going to check call all the way, and if the guy's trying to bluff you off the medium pair, then he's going to end up bluffing into your ace queen. And even worst case scenario, if he is actually only betting when he has a good hand, then you're not getting bluffed off your medium pairs because even if you're paying off with the ace queen when you shouldn't, then you're not getting bluffed off the medium pairs when he barrels at you.
That's so insightful. That's really great stuff. I can't wait to try and start experimenting with my game a little bit. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope it's helpful to you.
Absolutely. Chris Danette with Andrew Brokos for Card Player TV.